Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Unlocking New Possibilities, Redefining the Digital Front Door. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping details. Today's webinar is being recorded, and an online archive of today's event will be available a few days after the session. If you have trouble seeing the slides at any time during the presentation, please press F5 to refresh your screen or Command R if you're using a Mac. You may ask a question at any time during the presentation by typing your question into the Q&A box located on the right side of your screen and pressing Enter. And finally, I'd like to remind you of AHIP's antitrust statement located in the link just below the slide viewer. We will, as always, comply with that statement. Among other things, the antitrust statement prohibits us from discussing competitively sensitive information. We're very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Catherine Bass, Glenn Leary, Clint Porch, and Amanda Owens. Dr. Bass serves as the Senior Director of Informatics and Innovation at OnLife Health. Her areas of responsibility include data science, advanced analytics, reporting, and research. She holds a PhD in human and health performance with an emphasis in health promotion and has 20 years of experience in the health and wellness industry, including a national award from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention for innovations in healthy behavior data collection. As Vice President of Sales, Glenn identifies, cultivates, manages, and supports strategic partnerships with health plans, employers, and major benefit consulting firms nationwide in the health and well-being market. During his 33-year career, Glenn has created and led teams involved in business and product development, account management, growth operations, research, reporting, and contracting. Clint is Wellness Solutions Product Manager at Florida Blue Cross Blue Shield. He has over 20 years of experience in the health plan and provider settings and has served in several capacities with Florida Blue, including marketing and capability development. As Vice President of Brand and Market Strategy, Amanda leads corporate communications, brand marketing, public relations, and social media for Capital Blue Cross. At this time, I would like to turn the floor over to our speakers. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And my name is Glenn Leary. I am head of sales at OnLife. And first and foremost, I want to thank everybody for attending today. We've got a lot of attendees, so thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to thank the panelists in advance. We've got a great, panel here today from the perspective of data, marketing, and actually operations. So we're super excited. So I will serve as the moderator. And what we're going to do is essentially in the next hour, we're going to cover or try to cover 5 areas. So I'm going to be the time cop. We're going to talk about what is the digital front door in a broad context. What are the benefits of it? How do you implement it? Some of the lessons learned from an implementation perspective, how critical data is to the front door, and then end with the future, and really preserve time for questions at the end so that we'll be watching the feed. So please submit your questions on the chat, and what I will do is be the time cop and keep people kind of on track and keep us moving through that navigation. So when we think about digital front door, it's certainly not new to many industries. There's been a lot of research on it. It's a buzzword. A lot of health plans actually don't really like the term digital front door. There are different terms used like hub or digital transformation strategies. So what I want to do is just start by having the panelists just from your perspective, what is kind of the digital front door from your perspective? So Catherine, why don't you go first, and then Amanda, and then Clint.
Sure, thanks. So when I think about a digital front door strategy, or whatever you want to call it, the hub, whatever term somebody wants to use, for me, it is basically the concept of having a wraparound view of the member's experience and all the resources that they can leverage, that whatever entity that is providing that can offer for what the things that they want to do to help them along, whatever it is. But you're putting it into a context in which they can see it holistically, so they're not having to kind of search around for what it is they need. You're offering up to them the items that they need, or the resources, or the content that you want them to consume, in a way in which it's served up to them so that they're not having to go out and search for it. You really want to make this something that is anticipating their needs and making it as easy as possible for them to take the action that they need to take. And when you can leverage data, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, to do that in a really intelligent way, then you're having an experience, especially in the health plan world, that feels contemporary with all the consumer engagement giants out there like Amazon and Netflix. You're really taking a page out of their books and having an experience that is more in line with what consumers expect. And we lag a little bit behind, and sometimes in the healthcare world of being really innovative and on the front line there, it takes us a little while to kind of catch up. But the interesting thing is that the consumer engagement expectations have really soared in the last decade to this extremely high bar, because you're interacting again with the Amazons and the Netflixes and Instagram and Pinterest and even Airbnb. They have these really complex A and B testing, environments, and they're constantly testing what's working. And therefore, that sets the stage for the rest of us to really keep up with that. And so the digital front door strategy is a way for us to take a page out of their book, anticipate a need, and give the member a really comprehensive but easy to use experience.
Catherine, I would just jump right off of that to say for us, the digital first approach is really synonymous with our member and customer experience as well as our care navigation. So people, I think digital front door is I used to be in television, so it's a soundbite way of trying to communicate it, which serves its purpose. But I think what it also does is provide the wrong connotation that you're having everybody go in through the same door and only one entrance, when really these experiences are multiple touch points that aren't linear. So having and organizing your strategy and the way that you are trying to serve your members or customers is very important, but I do think it's a misnomer of sorts to call it a front door. Although if we're going to use that analogy, we want to make sure nobody's ever escaping out the back door. And so to your point, a lot of that has to do with what is the overall strategy, what is the data piece of it, which to me, there are two most integral pieces, and that is the collaboration of your teams, making sure everyone is on the same page, and we'll get to that a little bit later, and also the data, as you mentioned. But for us in building what that ideal experience is being where our members or customers want us to be to do what they want to do when they need or want to do it. And to your point, other industries have invested research and R&D and all kinds of capital investments in this for 20 years. And I think that probably our industries are a little bit slower because we don't have that cash to burn, nor do we want to burn it. Every dollar, we want to use every dollar to its highest integrity to serve patients and members. So I think it's been a little bit more difficult and challenging for the industry. But the good news is we can now, after they've done all the research, piggyback and jump on everything they've learned to implement it for us and come to meet those high expectations that not only our customers and members have, but that we have. And so that to me is where we're at. Clint?
Sure, and I think the audience can probably get a gist of our general sense of what that definition would look like. So just to add on to everybody's comments, it really depends. The definition of it depends. And really it depends on what's your consumer experience strategy. How is your consumer journey mapping going? What's the emphasis there? So the strategy before the strategy, I should say, before the definition is it's any front door, so to speak, should align with this overarching strategy and how we're going to engage with our members and how we think we should be doing it better. Because I think that's where the digital piece can come in and technology can improve those things. So to me, a front door or a common space is where we're going to bring to fruition all the wonderful resources, programs, content that a health plan needs our members to interact with. We're going to bring that into a common space in a meaningful and actionable way. So that's where health plans have to get to. You heard that from all the panelists. We have to get to a space that looks like that looks like the Amazons, that looks like the Netflix of the world, because we're not there, but we can't do it all at once. If you ask everybody across the payer space, what resource should we put out there? What program, what third-party entity should we put out there? You would have 500 different answers if you asked 500 people. So the front door can't be overwhelming once I get to the other side. So there has to be very thoughtful construction of what goes on behind this front door. But to answer your question, Glenn, really it's a space for a health plan to provide valuable, actionable information to our members, whether that be content, programs, whatever the case may be.
So thank you, all of you. So as we look to improving the consumer experience and building on what you have all said, what are the benefits of improving that consumer experience on the front end? So Amanda, why don't I just keep going with you, and then we'll go back to Clinton and to Catherine. So the benefits,
for us,
essentially.
Sure. So for us, it's the entire life cycle, right? So it's from a prospecting perspective, it's from an onboarding, welcoming perspective, from a retention, well, and before retention, full service perspective and retention. So for us, it is creating, just as Clint mentioned, that entire map of what is the life cycle of our different segments of members and customers, and what are those touch points, and how are we serving them in their time of not only need, but as I mentioned before, desire to interact with us. So one of the questions, just to get granular for a second, that has come up is, we were challenged with colleagues asking, well, why do we have duplicative services both from our mobile app and our website? And the answer is because people might prefer, or research shows they do prefer, to use the website for some things and use the mobile app for others. One of the things that we find is we have an inordinately high number of desktop users, which in other industries doesn't exist. My own personal philosophy, not a reflection of the company that I work from, but my personal philosophy on this is that people in their workday will spend time looking up their insurance information and don't want to spend their free time doing it, right? So to understand those patterns and habits and desires of your own, your prospecting base, your current members, and then where you want to head. So the benefits are many. I think the challenges are the pieces that we'll address in a little bit.
Okay, so Clint, can you talk a little bit about the benefits? And I'm sure you'll have things to share in implementation next, but from a benefits perspective, or the value you see in you kind of mapping this life cycle, can you build on that a little?
Yeah, I think there's benefits for both. I think there's benefits for a health plan. I think there's benefits for our membership. And so we really try to tie the two together. We did a lot of research for our latest go around of digital transformation. So we really studied what our members' pain points were. We wanted to understand what they needed more from us, what they needed from us to do better. And a lot of that is in the get care space, as we like to call it, where I'm going out now, I've got a condition, I need to go find a doctor to help do something about it. So for a member, if you can go to one place and be guided on the right way to do that, the right the right provider, the right types of services, what do your benefits look like in that space? If there's accumulator issues, how much accumulators do we have? So for a member, I'm going to now consolidate all these recommendations, all these things that I need about my care into one place. I'm really going to have a much better shot at more effectively managing that care. So better outcomes for our membership, which in turn is great for Florida Blue. It's great for payers. We're taking costs out of delivery of care if we can make it more efficient. So that's really the approach that we come at it with is, yes, there should be a benefit for the health plans. We should be able to bring all of our resources together and offer it up to our membership. But at the end of the day, the members have to want it. They have to want something out of going through this front door that they're going to get out of it. And so one of the big things that we see through our programs and resources is they like engaging with them. So if we can get them more of our population engaged, we get better outcomes. That's better for our membership. It's better for the health plan.
And Glenn, can I jump in there? I mean, Clint, it's a really good point. Yep. Because you can't make assumptions. You know, a lot of times, and I've used this analogy before, when if we were to select digital ads without A/B testing, Catherine, as you mentioned, I might choose the digital ad that I prefer, and it's 9 times out of 10 the wrong one that you never know what's going to end up testing the best in A/B testing. So understanding what they want, not trying to force people through the funnels that you set up, is a huge piece to planning and making sure that you have the strategy, the correct strategy in place.
So
And Amanda, I'll just
those
on
are
some.
no, what I was just going to say is these are excellent points in terms of preferences, right? And then informed navigation, like Clint was saying. So Catherine, why don't you talk a little bit about the data underpinning the life cycle, the preferences, the navigation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to pick up on one thing that Amanda just said about the A/B testing. I was literally having this conversation yesterday about how we have made mistakes in the past to assume, which we all know that that's not the right thing to do, and we still do it, assume the way people are going to interact. And we've been making some of those assumptions based on how we would interact, which is a completely different perception. We're in this field, we're building these things, we're in it all the time, things that feel obvious, intuitive, next step to us. When you actually get out and ask somebody else who has no context for this, they're coming in, blind, they may have a little bit of introduction, but basically blind to it, you really get insights that are completely missed. Even if you ask the entire company, what would your perspective be, or how would you influence this? It ends up being different from the people who use it. So I'm so glad you brought that up, and that we're all on the same page with that. You cannot assume how consumers are going to use your products, especially if you're the one designing the product. So I was really happy that you said that. But from a benefit standpoint, especially from a data perspective, this is the analogy I often think about and use when I talk about the front door. It's that kind of carnival experience where you go in a door and there's lots of other doors and mirrors, and eventually you can't figure out which one is the door and which one is the mirror. I feel like members often feel like that. They come into experiences, and especially with a health plan, and this is something I have learned working for health plans in the last 20 years, there is a lot of time and energy, and Amanda and Clint can certainly speak to this even more than I can, in effort put into all of the other resources that they want to offer members to have this really full, comprehensive experience that is so far beyond finding my provider, having a dispute about a claim. But when we talk to members, I had the opportunity to do some member interviews several years ago. And what was interesting was that when you talk to members, not only do they not know those resources are there, or they will only be aware of a portion of them, which is disappointing because there's so much time and effort and money spent on that. But also, they do not think of the health plan as the place where they go for those kind of resources. And when we spend time talking to our health plan clients, what we hear from them is that they really want to be that trusted resource for the member. And while they may fulfill that role in the healthcare side of things, all of that other stuff that they provide and offer is often overlooked or missed because there is so much stuff. And that's why I think this digital front door strategy, or again, whatever you want to refer to it as, is such a hot topic, is getting so much initiative around all of our health plan clients, because there's so much that they can be consuming and taking advantage of that they don't. So I think one of the things that is the benefit of this strategy is that we can take all of that data, every vendor that you've got, any piece of information you have about that member, so that we can understand more about them, and use that to then predict what are the things that they may need to be consuming, and provide it to them in a way that they can take that action. You're reducing that barrier to then taking that action and helping them do the next right thing in the easiest way possible. So that, for me, is one of the real benefits. Is it really ends up being on both sides. For the member, it's giving them this really easy experience and helps them take advantage of all of these resources that they have. And for the health plan, it starts building that bridge for the member to understand what the health plan's offering and all the different things that they can do with the health plan that is beyond just sort of that claims doctor provider kind of finding situation. So yeah, I think this is super important and will really be foundational to the way we operate in the future.
So when the strategies are approved and the budgets are approved, and you've made a commitment, right, as an organization to move this forward, let's just talk a little tactfully about what have you guys seen as kind of the challenges to kind of move this forward from an implementation kind of execution perspective, right? So I think collectively, as an industry, we recognize that this consumer experience has to be improved. And so, Clint, I'd like to start with you programmatically. So what do you think are some of the lessons learned or shared learnings you've got from an implementation perspective? And then I'll go back to Amanda and then back to you, Catherine. So Clint?
of unique perspectives on implementation of a strategy along these lines. So I've watched a vendor try to do it themselves, and now I'm watching Florida Blue take that same approach in a a similar fashion that some of these outside entities have. So I'll start with the first one where I've kind of observed and been a part of one of our partners trying to implement such a strategy. And really one of the biggest things, and Catherine will like hearing me say this, is that the flow of data has to absolutely be architected in a way that everybody speaks the same language, because point solutions have different ways of collecting information, massaging that information, reporting on that information. So the data has to be architected. It has to be locked in right at implementation. Everybody has to be on the same page about the flow of the data. It has to be quality data. It does good to do due diligence on your partners. It does good to do some research and talk to other customers and make sure that the data flows and the pie in the skies, all that stuff operates as it should. Because if it doesn't and the data doesn't flow, your front door is not going to open. It's going to stay shut. So another thing really to consider is that data, how it's going to flow and everybody understands the same thing. And so, programmatically, obviously, there's lots of things that we run off of our technology, of our platform. So having that data available, one, we have to know who's available for these programs. So making sure that you're targeting the right folks, the data is identifying all of the membership for these programs, and it's being surfaced up in a meaningful way. And we kind of talked about this early on in the discussion, but budgeting, being able to kind of roadmap out the initiative. Now that the strategy is locked in, we've got a good vision. You have to roadmap this thing for 5 years, really. I mean, you can't do it in a year. You can't do it in 2 years. We're looking at 2024 right now for some of our initiatives to be funded. So carefully curing for a roadmap and making sure that the enterprise is at the table with different stakeholders ready to fund it. Because it's not going to work if you're just trying to have one operational area leading our work and trying to fund it as well. It's really not going to play out. So it's really a good job to have that roadmap, have stakeholders at the table identifying what their needs and requirements are and funding them. That's a critical piece of it, because we're experiencing some of that now, where we had a lot of pie in the sky stuff scheduled to go in this year, had to cut about half of it. So for future considerations, roadmap and budgeting are really good lesson learned that I'd like to share with the audience.
Awesome. So Amanda, you're not nodding a lot, so go ahead.
Uh-oh, do I have a bobblehead going? I'll have to control that a little bit better. You guys just have really good points. So, yeah, there is no way to overstate how important data is, right? That is the absolute engine for how all of this works. I think in tandem with that, and obviously money is always a factor, and there are plenty of things that you can do in-house without massive budgets. The point is to get started, figure out, pick something, and to get started. And I'll come back to that later. But the other piece is the cross-functional, okay, here we go, the cross-functional collaboration of all teams. But truly, if you think about what you're trying to do, is you're trying to move members, customers across these different touch points across your entire organization. So if you have already existing silos and this department doesn't even know how to speak the same language, or they've never worked together, what department in your company is not going to be touched by this kind of work? Maybe facilities, maybe, I mean, every other portion of so to really think, and part of your strategy is the change management, is the intra communication within your organization, and to address some of those things where if there are teams that aren't used to working together, but to make sure that the communication across the organization is understood to what the goal is, because people will have ideas, and that's where these connections are made. And those are the things, in my opinion, you can't pay for. This isn't creating these strategies and execution is not about taking a box off the shelf, paying high dollar and plugging it in. This is everybody understanding where you're going, understanding what their role is, and that is a long-term timeline to get there. But if you don't start today, you're never going to get there tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've got the bobblehead.
Don't worry about the
bobblehead. Never aware of how much bobbleheading I do until COVID, and we're all on camera all the time. And I was like, I am just constantly shaking my head, just agreeing with you guys.
Don't worry. Do not worry about it. Do not worry about it. So, data as the underpinning all of this is critically important. That's been running through every single topic. But, and Catherine, I want you to run with it. But before you do, from an underpinnings perspective, what lessons have you learned, right, from an execution perspective? Like with stuff, we're trying to do this today. We're trying to do it the best we can. What have you learned so far? And then we'll segue to data playing the critical role as we look forward.
Yeah. First, I will say it warms my data heart to hear both Clint and Amanda recognize and understand how important this data is, because you just literally can't do it if you don't have the data, because it's not only about what the members, preferences are, what their needs are. You heard Clint saying, like, are they eligible for this program? And it's assessing that ID strat, or it's about being able to leverage the health plan's ID strat. They spend a lot of time, our health plan clients, on very sophisticated algorithms, leveraging the data that they have to develop these ID strat models. And it's not only about the data that you have, it's about the way in which you can leverage data that's out there. So we really try to focus on not only what can we do with the data and being able to bring a full suite of solutions to the table, but also depending on the health plan that you're working with. Health plans really vary in their sophistication across different departments, and some are much more sophisticated and funded in like the data analytics area, and there are others who may not be as much, especially if you've got kind of a smaller plan. So it's important for us to be able to bring the full suite of solutions, but also be able to leverage what a health plan already has out there. So it's not just about the data that you can take in or the data that you can leverage to make your own models. It's about how you can leverage data in any atmosphere. It's taking it in, it's doing that in a contemporary way, and then driving all of that to understand what is the member eligible for, what are their preferences, how would you like to serve this up, and then also being able to understand, okay, what is important to the health plan, what's important to the groups, what's important to the members, what's important to their point solutions. If you've got a variety of point solutions, which many health plans do, to offer all these great resources to the members, you also have to understand what they are offering, and then how you can serve up content in an appropriate way at the right time in the whole thing. So it is, I agree with Amanda, you cannot overstate the importance of data and investing in that. And so in what I have learned over the years is two things. You have got to have quality data, and that always sounds like a duh. Of course you do, but it takes so much effort and discipline to ensure that your data is clean. There's always going to be issues, especially because you're always building new kinds of data. But to make sure your data is clean and that you understand where there are variances and why things may look odd, and that you figure those things out, or figure out that, the way we collected this is not really appropriate because of the way we need to use it. And invest in that. You talked about budgeting for these things and understanding the value across different departments and making sure these things are not siloed. That's another big element. One department may use data in a certain way, and then another department may use that same piece of data but in a different way. So you may have to have data stored in different ways. You cannot underestimate the importance of really understanding how that piece of data is being used by the different end users, whether that's somebody in your company or the actual point solution or the member. So taking that time and really doing all of that work up front will continue to serve you well as you go down the path. And then the other thing that we have really learned is kind of what I was saying before, is being able to have a flexible enough architecture that you can take in different kinds of data sources, even things that may not feel totally 100% health related. Those additional data sources are very important to really have that comprehensive view of the member. So being able to focus on how you take in data, do that in a contemporary way, be able to take in all different kinds of data sources, and then also serve that up or be able to serve up portions of it and leverage what your health plan is bringing to the table has been something that also kind of continues to serve us well. And those are things that I would make sure that we were either doing or had a process to put in place if you're not already doing it.
So Amanda, I think you've talked about preferences, right? And consumers having different preferences. So when you think about this from a marketing perspective, it's exciting. You've got data increasing more and more every day. But then you have the consumers that you're trying to align not only their preferences, but their comfort. So talk to us about data from your perspective as a market leader, like being in marketing.
Yeah, again, super important. I think what Catherine just said about the other types of data, so behavioral things that may not have anything to do with healthcare, that cue us into, that help round out the picture of what we use as personas, because everybody is going to interact differently with any product or service. And so trying to narrow down who you're starting with and what you're trying to achieve with those different segments and different personas. And I think for us, we treat a Medicare member very differently than, say, a commercial group member. Geography is very different. I'd say that's probably one of the greatest factors, right, is geography and what is available to you and how do people choose to interact, what the political influences, where they live, what are, all of these things. And so it can become very overwhelming very quickly, to your point, Catherine, of new data sources every day. And it's difficult to build the most flexible platform up front when you don't know what it's supposed to look like in 2, 5, 10 years. So vision's really important. And the more people that you can bring into the process of figuring out what you want all of this to look like from a vision standpoint is also really invaluable. And I'm gonna be honest, we drown in data in terms of trying to figure out what's what, where it is, how to use it, because we're constantly looking for those clues. So for us, that's just a tremendous piece of this, as we said, the foundational element of being able to organize it, self-serve it, have there be appropriate analysis, and then make sure that it's feeding back into the system so that you can automate as much as possible. So that's just really, I think, the most important factor, besides, like I said, the collaboration element that has to occur across an organization. I have a feeling Clint has some specific.
Yeah, Clint, I wanted to pass it to you because you did talk and you about navigation and ensuring that you're leveraging data to navigate, first and foremost, services and providers, but then countless point solutions too. So talk to us a little bit about execution, implementation, and data, and how you guys have done that at Florida Blue.
Well, really, it's a lot of focus on stratification and hyper-personalization of whatever programs you're going to offer. So as a health plan, as a big health plan with millions of members, we've got lots of programs. We've got lots of members that we support on the entire care continuum, whether they're well, all the way to a chronic condition. So we have to have programs that support good outcomes across that entire care continuum. So data is obviously paramount to have good data. And so what we're finding is more and more programs support more and more verticals of that care continuum. So being able to surface up these very hyper-personalized programs requires good data, good stratification. So that's first and foremost on the front end. So being able to stratify and deliver the program timely to a nice set of individuals that truly need that service. That's where we've got to get to. And then I think secondly, data plays an important role in terms of what the member is going to see once they get into this front door. We've got lots of information. If you think about the journey, we do the journey mapping and talking about, the pre-sale on down to seeking care. What does that culmination of data look like whenever I come in as a member? You're going to throw it all at me at once and just say, here, take this, take that, take this. You're not. You're going to organize it in a very meaningful way, but you're going to have to parse through a lot of information and do some analysis and bring it together in a different way than we do now. So my enrollment data, my service data, my pharmacy data, claims data, not to mention all the third-party point solutions that we have our membership interact with. So being able to do that and execute on that, I think is critical to a good experience. We're not there yet. We're trying to get there, but I think being able to present information that comes from lots of different sources, data that comes from lots of different sources, that's actionable to a member is very important. In mind all those different subjects that we talked to them about. And then lastly, I think, in terms of data, importance to programming, measuring effectiveness, looking at our KPIs, looking at, is the program accomplishing what it's supposed to? Are you raising, enrollment in these programs to this new cool front door? Are the programs saving us money? We have to do lots of studying available in order to determine program effectiveness. And do we meet our KPIs? Because Florida won't do it if it's not taking costs out of the delivery of care, and we're meeting our KPIs. So we're very stringent in that regard, and we got to have data to do it.
Before we leave this data topic, I want to toss it back to you, Catherine, just because Amanda talked about personas, and you all talked about predictive analytics, and then the idea of not only cohorts, but then leveraging the data on the tail end, like Clint said, from an ROI perspective. So those are terms we all hear all the time. What's your experience reflect, or what's your perspective on that? And then we'll get to our last topic area before all the questions we're getting in the chat.
Yes, and I did want to add one more thing that I wanted to say on the lessons learned, and it does also speak to that cross-departmental, partnership that's important, or as a vendor or supplier partnership with Clint and with Amanda on these things. One of the things that I have also learned is that when you are doing this sort of back-end architectural work on data, it's really important for you to plan this out, in a way that's flexible. To Amanda's point, like, how do we know what it may look like in 5 or 10 years? So that's important to have flexible data collection so that you can kind of accommodate things as they come up. But also something I learned is that when the business has a hard time seeing what they're spending money on, they're reticent to spend that money. And so if you can plan things out so that you can deliver pieces of functionality along the way and prioritize what you build, that is also very helpful. So when you can work with your partners in other departments, other companies, to help articulate what that use case is and then prioritize your work so that you can deliver something tangible, that goes quite a long way. Otherwise, you have 2 years of work, a lot of money being spent, and then you've got finance breathing down your neck saying, what are you doing with all of this money? Because it's not cheap to do the data stuff. So I wanted to also point that out there. But to your point about the personas, and Amanda, you said something at the beginning, because this is such an overwhelming thing to take on. Like, you have to start somewhere. You've got to choose something and get going. We really took that approach several years back when we were really beginning to jump into this consumer engagement, personalization perspective, and really thinking about serving up content in a different way. And so we started with personas, and it was a great way to do that. It gives you something that is very intuitive to the end user. So when we go to talk to our clients or the groups we're serving, personas are something that they understand and doesn't take a lot of sort of technical speak to get your point across. And it does give you a way to have a personalized experience that's not a one size fits all. It might be if you've got 5 or 6 personas, it's a 5 or 6 sizes fit all. And there's a place for that, and there's an appropriateness there. We leverage that. We see great results from, like, if you look at click-through data, we see better engagement from people who are being promoted content that matches a persona tag than if it's just got regular content or non-tagged content in their view. But then you heard Clint say something, hyper-personalized, and that is also the wave. I don't even know if it's the wave of the future. It's just where we are now. Everything is really down to the member level. When you talk about, like, when you reference studies, you'll often hear people say, refer to the sample size as an N. So the study might have had 400 people in it. N would equal 400. When we talk about hyper-personalization, N equals 1. One size fits one. And that's an important piece to really ensure that we're staying up with the expectations of consumer experiences that I was referencing earlier on the call. It needs to be something where, if Clint and Amanda and Glenn and I are all the same persona based on, maybe our demographics, where we live, that kind of thing, there are still going to be nuances in the way in which we want to consume data, things that are important to us. And so understanding as much as you can about that person, I know I say this all the time, and I've said it multiple times here, getting as much of a comprehensive view as you can about that person helps you have that N of one experience for them. And that's so important. And it's why the data part of this is not just about how you serve up content or ensuring that it's not just not confusing, but actually specific and intentional. And you can do that for that person. That captures that person's attention. That helps them understand, oh, this is really specific to me. I'll pay attention to it. Our minds are incredible at adapting. If you have the exact same content on your page and it's static, and that person scrolls to something and comes back and that data is the same, their mind automatically starts clicking in, oh, I don't need to relook at that because I've already viewed that and consumed it. If that data dynamically orders every time they refresh the page, and it continues to be something that's relevant to them, their mind's like, oh, I need to keep going back and looking at that and make sure I'm taking in whatever is new. And so we need to keep those principles in mind as we're thinking about, do we use personas? When is it appropriate to go down to the person level? And you have to have data to understand all of those things, but then you have to have really strong partnerships with your business leaders so that we can understand what's important to them to surface in the experience. And I just can't state that the importance of that enough. You have got to be constantly connected with what the end user wants, with what your health plan or your group wants, and then connect all that through data so you can serve those things up appropriately.
Lynn, if I can add to that real quickly. So a couple of things. The personas are not only, so obviously in marketing, that's our, a tool we use consistently, right? It's in our wheelhouse. But what we did at Capital Blue Cross was also turn that inward. And we did a member engagement and campaign for our employees where we took those personas, we actually found real people, real members, and did videos with them, did articles, we did infographics, we had an entire campaign so that we are connecting those that think they think of the member, but we know they really don't, to help it make it live. And interestingly enough, we kicked a lot of that off right before the pandemic. And so the virtual environment helped us tremendously because we were able to create virtual backgrounds to keep the member in the room, and just continue to stimulate that thought and that perspective of why are we doing what we're doing. It's not just the big actions, it's not just the big strategies, it's the daily decision making on the rank and file and everyone else that impacts where we're headed. So to have that be a continual presence in the room and in the minds of all of our employees has made a real difference in people coming up with ideas and making those connections. And again, the cross-departmental cooperation, collaboration, understanding to make it happen.
Perfect. Okay, so I've been watching the game clock. You guys are doing great. What I want to do is I want to get to a lot of the questions that are coming in. So if you could each take 1 minute, kind of a lightning round here, and project out what the future, what do you think the future looks like in 3 to 5 years of this whole consumer experience in the front door?
I can start.
I'm sorry, Amanda. Yeah, Amanda, why don't you start? Thanks.
That's fine. I was going to say, I don't think it takes much to look into the crystal ball to say it's going to get faster and noisier, right? So now's the time. Now's the time to plan, start carving out the identity for your organization to make it work and to take small steps. It doesn't have to be a huge budget. You just have to get started. And one of the ways we did that was picking one facet, one program, and looking at how to improve that, how to build that, instead of stepping back and trying to bake the entire thing at one time. but to iterate on it and just continue to grow and continue to pull in more and more people. But I lean on the two words of synergy and simplicity. And you have to have, as I mentioned several times now, the synergy within and the enthusiasm within your organization to want to do this and to understand why it's important. And then also, Catherine, I loved your visual. I'm a very visual person. I love the visual of you were saying coming through the front door into a circus. And it's that's overwhelming, right? So the simplicity, simple solutions are very difficult to architect, right? But that's where we have to start as well, is what is the one action, what is the one area, what is the one thing that we want to improve on or design, and just start. But as to the whole landscape, I choose to put blinders on a little bit, so that we can focus. Because you can get overwhelmed and people can go off in a whole array of different directions, right? So I think as leaders, that's part of our job, is to say, here's where we think it's headed, but we are also going to keep a focus on what we're doing, not necessarily on what everybody else is doing. You have to have an ear open to it, right? But focus.
Okay. Catherine, why don't you go for a minute, then Clint, and then I'm going to prioritize these questions and start asking you guys questions.
Yeah, and I actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to pull one of the questions into my response about the future. I'm actually going to pull in two questions. Someone was asking about, as data is scaling, and we're going to be taking in all kinds of data sources, even those that may not be, traditionally related to healthcare, and thinking about the volume of data. We used to talk about terabytes, and it was only really big companies that were using terabytes. Like, everybody's using terabytes now. We were creating so much data in an hour that we would have created in months 5 or 6 years ago. We just have had a hockey stick kind of graphic on how much data we actually produce. And they were, part of the question was, are you seeing a shift from on-prem to cloud? And the answer is absolutely. And part of that is because the cloud options offer you that scalability, and you can, especially if you go out seasonality in your data, when you take things in, you can kind of scale up and scale down. And that's been an interesting shift in the healthcare world that Amanda and Clint could probably comment on as well, because cloud is newer, not new right now, but it's a newer technology. There's been a lot of legal steps that people have gone through with health plans, thinking through privacy, security, vulnerabilities around all of that, and really ensuring that these cloud solutions are secure, and that they've got high trust certifications and those kinds of things that give us comfort when we're using them. So when I think about the future, that is absolutely one of the things that I think about, is how you handle all of this data. And I think one of the things that's really important, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, is making sure you have contemporary ways to ingest that data and store it, especially because you've got, again, those different business units and different end users will need a piece of data in a different way. So rather than the traditional ETL, extract, transform, and load, we're really kind of moving more to extract, load, and transform, so that you've got the data sitting there, and then when you need it, depending on who the end user is, then you load it into their, whatever system they're using, and transform it based on what they need. And so it's a bit of a different shift there, to having that, the way in which you access that data. And then the other question I was going to bring in is people were asking about, do you go beyond ID strat when you're talking about how you leverage machine learning and AI? It's another future landscape here. Absolutely. And that's not even that future. We're doing that already to really try to understand what the consumer wants. It's really sort of going back to A/B testing. Sometimes it's directly asking them, whether that's through direct interviews, focus groups, whether that's putting on the screen, what's your concern today, and letting them choose something, and then going and being able to have architecture that's flexible enough to immediately respond to that. So there's a lot of ways that we need to shift the way we think about the experience. And then when you envision that experience, then you can start backing into, then that means I'm going to have to do data collection in this way, accessibility, understand the provenance. There's a huge data governance kind of aspect to this. And so those things need to be done now to support what you're doing in the future. So I would say, again, you cannot underestimate the importance of really investing in that architecture.
Great. And I appreciate you guys looking at the chat as I'm looking at it too. So Clint, I want to turn it over to you in terms of the consumer experience from an execution kind of programmatic perspective, because you bring that to the table, what does it look like with the health plans like Florida Blue and others that are doing this right in 3 to 5 years? How does it look different?
Well, I think one thing that's going to be consistent is that everybody's going to be doing it, and the winners are going to be doing it well in terms of bringing the data together and the experience together. So I think you'll find that this is a commonplace in the industry now, in the payer industry, that everybody's racing towards this great user experience, member experience that rivals the great consumer oriented companies of today. I think that's a trajectory that health plans will get on and stay on in 5 years. And I wanted to go back to something that was mentioned in the opening statement in terms of there's not really only one front door. We really think of them as channels, but maybe a greater access to resources. And one thing I think future-wise that we didn't talk about today, but is definitely in the mix. I'm involved in some of the prototyping, is the use of voice-activated technology to really guide members on some of these journeys that they have with us. And so specifically, the prototype we're working with Amazon now is for our diabetic members. What does a conversation with Alexa look like to help me understand what diabetes is, help me refill prescriptions, understand benefits, and then connect me to a nurse if I need to? So we're looking at ways to leverage voice-activated technologies, the Googles, the Alexas, in support of this front door concept to make sure that they get the right resources that they need to, especially regarding that long and complicated sometimes journey that they have with the health plan. So for me, one of the things I'm looking forward to is figuring out new and cool ways to leverage voice-activated technology in this space.
Great.
In addition to that,
okay, so
I bet you guys are probably on the race to wearables as well, and the data coming from and the metabolic ability to detect metabolic changes and everything. I mean, it is super exciting. What a great point.
So one of the questions that came in, I was just looking at the chat, is using the data we've talked a ton about to become more proactive. And so Amanda, can you talk a little bit about when you have so much data and you're trying to simplify the clutter, how do we become more proactive versus passive as an industry in terms of that consumer and getting that consumer?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, for us, to, again, the idea of simplicity and focus. Because if you're just following what's coming in, or you're following a business unit that's excited because they now have access to X, Y, or Z and they've got this, it's easy to get sidetracked, right? So really having that discipline to stick to what you have designed. And yes, the nuance of being able to pivot if need be, but to really keep that focus and make sure that what you're doing is serving more than just the member experience. And that's why I said to us, it's synonymous, that the digital experience is synonymous with the member experience, customer experience, and care navigation. So it's working really closely with our clinical and population health teams. What are your goals? How are they changing? What are we doing from a diabetic reversal standpoint? How are we ensuring that those touch points are always met, and really taking all of those things? Because one thing I've noticed with the data is that many business units within the organization will sometimes feel that that's their data. So again, going with the visual, it's like, is it being put in a location, in layman's terms, it's not my area of expertise on the technology, storage, and retrieval of the data, but is it being put in places that are accessible to the entire system? Because if somebody feels like it's just their work, and not in a selfish way, but it's just their work, then that deprives the rest of the organization the ability to make those connections and form that complete picture, that complete experience. And I think that's when Clint was talking, that was the word that kept sticking out to me, because now it's a buzz term, but you have to stop and really think about what that means. It's not being told information, it's not being pulled data, it is providing an actual experience.
Okay. A question that also came in, kind of more of a tactical one, is when you did those focus groups, both, I think, Catherine, you mentioned them, but Amanda, you certainly did. What kinds of questions were you asking the members in those focus groups to really get at their preferences? And how'd you do it?
So we are continually surveying, engaging, requesting feedback, doing brand research, and that's part of our 360 view of the member, right? So we have feedback cards on our website, we have annual and sub-annual surveys, all of that data to try to hear and gather information on what members, because you can't have I think to Catherine's point earlier, focus group of one. Well, here's how I like to do it. But how many times in a meeting do you hear someone say, "Well, I don't really like it that way." It's not about you. And so trying to be empirical with the information and to gather that. So what types of questions? I mean, really for the 360 view of the member, we're looking at just about everything that they touch and what their preferences are and what their needs are, and down to the minutia of, is this button working in this place? So again, it really depends on who's asking and why, and going back to your strategy of what are you focused on trying to achieve at this particular point, and making sure that you're gathering that data to solve that question or problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another question that came in was kind of during the data segment, and that is, you guys talked about claims and you talked about different data sources and the analytics, and then the programs that you want to serve up and navigate being some of the core things that we typically do. One question came in about EHR. So the electronic health record data that's out there. Maybe Catherine, can you speak to EHR and the EHR data and how that plays to the maybe the navigation that Clint was talking about? That was one of the questions in the feed.
Yep, absolutely. And so, electronic health records, certainly an excellent source of data, depending on who's implemented and how they're maintaining it. There's a lot of variability with the quality of data that you get from an EHR. Some organizations just don't support it in the way that it needs to be supported, and that's not pointing fingers. It's just sometimes it's about allocation of resources and what you can maintain. But if you have really clean quality data in an EHR, it's excellent information to have. Again, I'm coming from the data perspective, so I want all the data. I want everything you can give me, because you just never know what little piece may tip an insight that you're just like, I didn't know that, and you just don't know those things until you have the data. So EHR would be an excellent thing to have is incorporated into your entire data model, so that again you're getting that full view of somebody. And the other piece of this, and you heard Clint talk about it, is really being able to articulate the value story. We're not investing in anything. Nobody's investing in things these days that are not really showing the revenue and being able to recoup your value that you've invested in that. And so being able to demonstrate that full story, I think, is really powerful. And so that's one of the things that we have done that has resonated with our health plan clients is being able to say, you've got Glenn here, and not only is he doing stuff with OnLife and he's doing some of the things with some of the other vendors, this is a way for us to pull everything together and say, this is Glenn, and here's the total picture of all the things that touched it. It may be the nurse line, wellness, it could be EAP, I was going to say maternity programs, bad example because I chose Glenn, but let's say we're talking about Amanda, maternity programs. It could be things like care for the caregiver. And so if you can pull in all of that data, then you're able to articulate that value story in a way that really tells it across the board and not just your siloed piece. Because the reality is, when you've got all of these different experiences, nothing's siloed anymore. So even if you saw, one thing in wellness, it may have been amplified by something that they might have gotten in a diabetes particular program, so nothing's really siloed. Everything is touching and influencing what that member does. So when you have all that data together, then you can tell that story really helpful, in a really helpful way. So the EHR data will often have, the biometric values that you may want to be reporting on, in addition to things related to claim savings or behaviors that they're demonstrating. So it's a really important piece if you can get some good quality data from an EHR.
All right, thanks. We've got 1 minute left. There are more questions on behavioral health and social determinants of health and stuff, but I want to give you each about 20 seconds and for any parting fragment of words to summarize stuff. We will send answers to the questions that have been submitted, but Amanda, why don't you take off? We'll go Amanda, Clint, and Catherine.
If you feel like you haven't figured it out or that you are behind no matter what, you're not the only ones. I feel like we're constantly in a state of infancy. Maybe we are, but I certainly feel among our peers and those we've collaborated with, everyone's kind of in the same boat. And I think moving forward, it's just the name of the game. The world's moving faster and faster. So get on the train and start somewhere, improve what you got.
Clint, do you have a few seconds? Because I know we are over.
Sure, ditto to what Amanda said. Spend a lot of time on your vision and strategy for what you want to see accomplished here, and make sure that it aligns to your overall mission for your membership, and make sure it aligns to your strategy for your member experience, and then commit to it. You have to commit resources to it. It can't just be, I'm going to show up at this meeting and make a few decisions and here we go, we got our great strategy and we're going to implement now. There has to be some dedicated resources and commitment made to push this strategy through. So lesson learned there, commit some resources and some funding for sure.
And Catherine, finally?
And to follow up on that, to follow up on exactly what Clint said from the data perspective, make sure you get with that business person, understand what their vision is, and then you can articulate the value story for investing in your data, because you're going to have to do that and prove to the business that this is important. And when you can understand what that vision is, you can then talk about why you're doing things with your data to support that. And that will always resonate.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. I'm very sorry this went a minute over, and thank you for everyone who hung in there and attended today. So thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you to our speakers. We thank you for that great presentation and for sharing your thoughts. And thank you to the audience for participating in today's webinar. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.